Welcome to our second seminar in our Native American Heritage Month that we're doing. Last week, we had a great talk with Professor Juliana Nessie. This week, our professor that we're featuring is our very own Desi Small-Rodriguez, who is Northern Cheyenne and Chicana. She's an assistant professor in sociology and American Indian studies here at UCLA. She's a social demographer, and she does work on critical, quantitative, and mixed methods to look at the intersection of race, indigeneity, data, and inequality, and has a wide range of experiences with all kinds of amazing data sets and analyses, both domestically and internationally. And so again, we welcome all of you, and we welcome Dr. Small-Rodriguez. And she'll start us off telling us a little bit about her current research and what it is she's undergoing right now, what she's exploring. And then we'll open up for question and answers after that. So with that, we'll give you the floor, Dr. Small-Rodriguez.
You may be on mute.
You're still muted. How do we unmute you? Hang on just a second. Technical difficulties. Oh, it's an earbuds thing. Okay, everyone, we're having technical difficulties, but she'll start up shortly. So,
hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yay. Okay, sorry, Randy. I don't know. These earbuds are probably busted. Okay. 1 second. Let me turn this on. Okay. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Okay.
Okay, great. Sorry. Thanks, Randy, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I do in my research. I'm a social demographer. I got PhDs in demography as well as in sociology, and so I use a variety of data from everything from the census to administrative data sets to data that I build in partnership with tribal communities and with tribal nations, to a lot of survey research. Essentially building data for Indigenous peoples, by Indigenous peoples, to answer the questions that we want answered. And so we've moved into, we're firmly in this era in terms of Indigenous research and scholarship, collecting data by us and for us. And so this, this kind of narrative of nothing about us without us is very alive and well in Indian country, and particularly in our research. And so I just want to talk a little bit about, I guess, what kind of the work that I do and how Indigenous data sovereignty and governance practices and policies is really infused in everything that I do. I teach in both American Indian Studies here at UCLA, as well as in the sociology department. And I run the Data Warriors Lab, which is a social science laboratory here on campus and we work very closely with tribal communities, tribal colleges and universities, as well as with students and lots of different institutions. So I have high school students who are part of the lab. I have undergrads, graduate students. And so it's really cool to finally be on campus and to be able to train students and to continue to grow that aspect of what I do. So I'm just going to share a few slides here and happy to take questions as well. So I don't know how you want to, do you want me to just present first, Randy, and then we can go through some questions?
Yeah, so let's have you sort of talk a little bit about your research now, and then, we'll give you 10, 15 minutes uninterrupted, and then I'll jump in when you're, about ready, and then I'll start moderating questions.
Cool, okay, let me just share then a little bit. Awesome. So a lot of the work that I do, I call it research for Indigenous futures. It's looking at data, it's looking at our stories, it's looking at how do we build how do we build futures, Indigenous futures that are informed by Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and being, and how can data support that? And so that's the type of research that I do, and that's what I call it, this research for Indigenous futures. I'm active on Twitter and email. I'm happy to connect with folks online in whatever way works. I'm also in Haynes Hall, room 244. I have an office now, which is really exciting. So, and this is my son, Nota. He's 5 now, so this was a couple of years ago. I'd like to just acknowledge that we're on Togama lands here at UCLA and what is now known as Los Angeles. I'm really honored to be a guest here on these lands and do my best to honor that role. I also acknowledge my own homelands and where I come from. I'm a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation. I'm also Chicana. I was raised bicultural. I was raised bilingual, trilingual, if you count knowing commands and knowing how to get in trouble in Cheyenne. So I acknowledge my people's homelands, the Tsistats and the Suttat people, which our reservation is in what is now known as southeastern Montana. And that's where I was born and raised, and those are the lands and the waters that raised me and to whom I am responsible. So when I started doing this work, it became very clear in thinking about, being a demographer is not something I planned to be. I didn't even know what a demographer was when I was studying in college. I received very amazing mentoring from Professor Matthew Snip, who is a Indigenous demographer at Stanford, and I trained under him, and kind of got propelled into this career trajectory by a lot of chance, I guess, also through networks. And so what I've come to realize, right, is that there is this central question of who are Indigenous peoples in the world, in what is currently called the United States, in North America. And I often get this question of should we call them American Indian or Native American, or are they Indigenous? Do we call people by their tribe or multiple tribes? And this, I don't know, probably a lot of folks saw this, right? This CNN exit poll during the election, this latest national election, right? Where we were completely excluded, right? Erased as Indigenous peoples in this exit poll, where whites were captured and Latinos and Blacks and Asians, but Native peoples, right? We fell under this category of something else. And there were so many memes and so many really funny things that, that came out from this, because that's what we do as Indigenous peoples, right? We take awful things and we turn them into comedy so that we can keep going and we can continue to thrive. But this is really an example, right, of this pervasive Indigenous erasure, which is something that I study. And I often tell folks that all of these questions, right, about who are Indigenous peoples and how should we categorize them and classify them and what should we call them, those are questions that need to be answered by Indigenous peoples and only by Indigenous peoples. And so that kind of led me to the work that I do as an Indigenous demographer. And it's really guided by this Maori proverb. So I did one of my PhDs in Aotearoa, New Zealand, working in partnership and learning from Maori scholars and Maori tribal leaders and Maori communities. And I owe a huge debt of gratitude to them for taking me under their wings and teaching me about Indigenous data and about Indigenous demography and the power and the strength that comes from telling our own stories, using our own data on our terms. And so this is a Maori proverb that says, "He aha te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata." What is the most important thing in the world? It is the people. It is the people. It is the people. And so I study people. I study Indigenous peoples, and I do it largely through survey methods. I am a survey researcher. It's kind of my bread and butter and what I like to nerd out about. I also have this Data Warriors Lab, which is, we're trying to train this new generation of data warriors in Indian country, data warriors that can go into all sorts of fields and areas of study, but who have an understanding of basic kind of analytics and data analytics, and can collect data and that support our tribal communities. And so that goes to kind of how we start to think about Indigenous peoples in this country. And what a lot of folks don't understand or don't realize is that there's a federal definition of American Indian or Alaska Native. The feds have established it, and it includes Central and South American Indigenous peoples. And so that is something that's very important to know, because we have so many, right, of our Indigenous relatives from Mexico, from Central and South America, who are making up a significant, population here in this country now, and they are included in this definition of who is an American Indian or Alaska Native. And so I am also venturing into some work in partnership with or in collaboration with some other researchers to really look at the boundaries of indigeneity and how Indigenous peoples who are not from, the kind of the United States are very much excluded, even though they are included or should be included according to this definition. I also look at how there's a difference between populations and peoples, right? So populations are these aggregate categories of individuals that are grouped together, right, to be the state does this, right, to make us legible to the state, to the federal government, to other nation states, right? We get grouped together into these population categories, but that's very different from who we are as peoples, as nations. And so I distinguish my work as a demographer by looking at both peoples, so tribal demography and Native nations, as well as American Indian and Alaska Native people populations. A lot of you have seen this GIF, right? I often share this, and just thinking about where we're at this point in U.S. colonialism, and thinking about how we are now at 574 federally recognized tribes. We have over 300 reservations and over 50 million acres of trust land. But what once was is very different than what we have now. And thinking about the sheer dispossession, right, of lands, and how that has translated into so much erasure of who we are as Indigenous peoples in our own homelands. So I have a kind of central question that sits at the foundation of my research, and it is: how do sociopolitical processes, ideologies, and institutions construct, control, and erase populations, peoples, and knowledges? This is the work that I do. It's super kind of broad because I'm a social scientist. I'm very interdisciplinary in the work that I do. And I look at structures and systems and how they impact and erase and continue to perpetuate inequality. And my focus, of course, is on our Indigenous peoples, on Indigenous peoples. So I have three kind of main areas in which I published. One is Indigenous erasure and resistance. Two is Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. And three is this kind of emerging work that I'm doing on data for health and economic justice on Indian reservations. And I collaborate a lot with Professor Randy Akey in that space. And that's really the work that I've been doing over the last year, has really been looking at COVID data, as well as health disparities, kind of the social determinants of health. So I want to just kind of, I don't have much time, but I want to really anchor the work that I do and this talk in sovereignty. This is a quote by one of my former tribal presidents who I worked for. I ran for our tribal council. I lost, but the outcome of that was I ended up getting hired by our tribal president, who was recently elected, and served as his advisor on research and policy for several years back home. And he always said, tribal sovereignty is only as strong as we exercise it. And so we need to keep exercising our sovereignty as Native nations. We need to do what we can as citizens of Native nations, as well as, as scholars and as policymakers and as allies, to continue to uphold and reinforce sovereignty, because it is always, there is always threat, right? Sovereignty is always at risk in this country. Tribal sovereignty, there is always threat of erosion, and it's happening all the time. And we see it, right, through our courts. That's why we have so many tribal lawyers, right? Because we've had to get really good at litigating. But I also offer that, Indigenous scholars, we have a role to play as well in building the evidence base, right? And continue to grow that evidence base and continue to build these data systems that can support sovereignty. when I first started this work, I did a series of interviews with tribal leaders to try to understand how data might fit into these conceptions of sovereignty for Native nations. And this is one of the quotes that has really propelled my work. It's a quote by a tribal leader who said that sovereignty as tribal nations was given to us by the Creator, and it is sacred. So data to exercise our sovereignty is also sacred. And so that really propels what I do. I developed a tribal futures methodology. So this came out of my dissertation research. I am very much a critical quantitative researcher. I do a lot of quantitative research, but that research that I do that is quantitative is very much also informed by qualitative research and really dovetails qualitative research. So I guess if I had to kind of put myself in a box, I'd probably call myself a mixed methods researcher. So the tribal futures methodology that research that I do is I lead with questions that are driven by tribal communities and indigenous communities about their futures. And that emerges from qualitative research. So we have to go and talk to people, right? And we have to talk story, and we have to gather those stories. And those stories lead to questions. Then I then take stock of the available data that is out there on tribal peoples to answer those questions and acknowledge that there are limitations, right? There are a lot of limitations out there with respect to data that exist. And so we have to fill those data gaps. That's this kind of step 3. We have to reclaim existing data, and we have to build new data. And it's often a very messy process. And that's okay. Messy can be good, right? It's intense, and it can be a lot of work, but I am a firm believer that messy data can be good, especially when we're thinking about how to fill these data gaps that continue to perpetuate Indigenous erasure. And then the last kind of step of this methodology is to embrace quantitative methods and statistical techniques to answer these research questions. And my work is continuously grounded in Indigenous self-determination and partnership and reciprocity. And I often say that, I am a researcher, but before everything else, I'm a relative, and I can't be a good researcher unless I'm a good relative. So I guess, Randy, I have a lot of slides because I kind of pulled lots of different things together. But what I want to do is maybe just kind of show the kind of more recent projects that I'm doing, and then maybe kind of answer more questions after that. So, okay, cool. So I've got a project right now on indigeneity and racialization, really looking at the boundaries of indigeneity and how our identities as Indigenous peoples are very much constrained and controlled by this American US racial logic of blood quantum. And so I look at the kind of intersection of citizenship and race for Indigenous peoples. This latest publication came out this year. This was part of my dissertation research, which looked at the bloodline and really assessed. I built a data set from the ground up, collecting lots of different, basically using both a lot of existing tribal constitutions, as well as different databases that are out there, as well as contacting tribes directly to develop this tribal citizenship database. And I have about 80% of tribes, federally recognized tribes in that database. So I've got a lot of research coming out of that, but this is the first piece of that really kind of looked at the heterogeneity of tribal citizenship criteria amongst tribal nations in the US, and really showing that, blood quantum remains a very durable very durable construct and very durable criteria for belonging. And so I'm expanding this work to also look at kind of how this impacts not just US tribes, but also looking at the boundaries of indigeneity in Mexico as well as in New Zealand. So New Zealand did away with blood quantum in the 80s. They have a much more inclusive system of acknowledging who belongs. And so I've got a book project that's coming out of this that's going to look at kind of this comparative historical indigeneity and racialization research. So that's that work. And I've got some really cool students helping me work on that, which I'm excited about. And hopefully we might be able to get to Mexico at some point if the world cooperates. So I also do a lot of work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and looking at MMIW data. One of, an incredibly, we are incredibly erased in these data systems that are controlled by federal agencies. And when we are present in these data, right, we know that it is in ways that are often incomplete. But we know that MMIW continues to be an incredibly important and call to arms, really, as policymakers as well as relatives and as scholars. And so I work I'm on the board of directors for the Sovereign Bodies Institute. We're the stewards of the MMIW database. And so I do a lot of advocacy, but also do quite a bit of data work to support the movement, and really trying to figure out how do we plug the data gaps that exist as well, and how do we navigate all of the different jurisdictions to secure existing data as well as build new data, and how do we do that in partnership with survivors and with family members, how to do that in a good way, how do we continue to press law enforcement and these systems to be more responsive. And so I come at this from a data perspective, but I'm also, I also am a part of a family who lost many women to this as well. So it's also very much a personal quest, in addition to a scholarly quest, right? Which is what a lot of our work is, I think, as Indigenous scholars and researchers. I also kind of got thrown into COVID work, which I think all of us did. When COVID hit and our communities became so impacted, we just kind of all had to figure out, how do we use our skills to do good? How do we be good relatives? And it became clear that there was some research that could be done to try to support that kind of early pandemic response in Indian country. And so with some colleagues, I was thankful to be able to support some of this early COVID response and policy work through some of this research. We got an article out with Professor Key as well as some other colleagues, and looking at kind of early correlates of infection rates in the pandemic. And then that also led to another bit of work looking at social determinants, essentially, of mortality and disparities in health outcomes for American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so I did this also with Professor Key, where we looked at kind of looking at disaggregated data for American Indians and Alaska Natives in California. And we found that there was no standard for the collection of tribal enrollment data or any sort of death certificate in the US. And that there were stark differences in terms of incidence and prevalence of health risks and factors that contribute to death for tribally enrolled subpopulations. So there's a lot of work to be done here, and really looking at what does it mean to be a tribally enrolled citizen? How does that population differ from the kind of the broader population of American Indians and Alaska Natives? And so again, we really need to start thinking about Indigenous peoples and our populations as not as homogenous, right? We're diverse. And our data and our research needs to align with that. And so there's a lot of work to be done. I have a really cool project right now working with a sociology graduate student here at UCLA. We're doing a project looking at reproductive justice for American Indian and Alaska Native women in the time of COVID-19. So we've got a lot of, it's a mixed methods project. We're interviewing American Indian, Alaska Native women, as well as birth workers, to really kind of investigate whether how has COVID-19 impacted the reproductive experiences of these women, of these individuals who have given birth. And so we are finding that there's, the disparities are very much amplified right now. And we also are seeing that there is a bit of a baby boom happening in Indian country as well. So as a demographer, it's kind of exciting to kind of start thinking about these kind of demographic dividends and how the increase kind of in birth rates, what that's going to look like for our tribes and our communities down the road. So yeah, I guess I'll just end on this, that I also kind of have this big future research agenda that's really looking at a critical demography of tribal peoples, and that really seeks to unpack the difference between American Indian and Alaska Native demography, which is this kind of colonial approach to studying Indigenous populations, and really juxtaposing that with tribal demography, which is looking at who we are as peoples and as nations. And so I look at kind of these two questions about how does American Indian and Alaska Native demography, what does that tell us about tribal populations, but also what does it not, right? Where are the gaps? And then how are Native nations responding to the limitations of that? And so for this work, I'm doing a lot of exciting work in projecting tribal population growth, as well as looking at how that growth is influenced by blood quantum criteria. So lots of tribes are starting to rethink their criteria for belonging. So some tribes are dropping their criteria, and reducing their blood quantum criteria. Some are doing away with it altogether. Some are doing really kind of innovative things where they're bringing in different blood and counting, like allied tribes, or and so really kind of thinking about how these boundaries of belonging are quite fluid, and they're changing depending on kind of the demographic realities that we are facing as Indigenous peoples. And so that's another big part of what I'm doing, is really figuring out how we can move towards a critical demography of tribal peoples, and how we can ensure that tribal nations and tribal leaders are leading that are leading that work. So I guess I'll just leave it there, Andy, and you can let me know.
Well, thank you very much. Give a applause, everyone, or virtual. Thank you very much. So I want to ask you a question, and then open up to the rest of the audience as well, a question. Before I do that, let me just say to everyone that this event, and I forgot to say that earlier, is co-sponsored with both American Indian Studies IDP and the American Indian Studies Center, but also the Pacific Islander Students Association, the American Indian Students Association, the undergraduates, as well as the Graduate Students Association, as well as UCLA Health, for this Native American Heritage Month. So we've got a lot of groups that are behind us on this wonderful series of speakers that we have this month. So Dr. Small-Rodriguez, let me ask you a question. What's been the response you've gotten from, say, tribal leaders, community members in your work? How do they see you and the contributions that you bring? What has been your experience? Because you're unusual in a good sense, in terms of bringing data to communities, bringing interesting, novel data into different spaces. Tell us, the audience, what your response has been from different levels, and maybe even from governmental, non-tribal levels as well. Maybe it's negative pushback as well. I don't know, but tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, I feel like I often tell people that as an Indigenous person, I feel like I was born a skeptic. So I'm always very skeptical of like what is out there, what exists, right? And the narratives that are being told about us in lots of different spaces, including in our own tribal communities. And so, and I remember presenting at one point. So part of my dissertation research was looking at tribal population projections for my own tribe, and having to convince my tribal leaders and our tribal council to allow me to access our most precious data, which is our enrollment data on our people, and to look at the kind of distribution of blood quantum for the Northern Cheyenne Nation, and projecting out, if we were to change our blood quantum, if we were to drop it or increase it, what would our tribe look like? How would the size change? And so it telling tribal leaders, or trying to ask tribal leaders to put their trust into me, my own tribal leaders, right, was very hard. But I also firmly believe that, for me, that is my responsibility. My responsibility is to be a good relative, and to do that work in my own community first, before I can really feel like I can do that for other tribal communities. And so I think because I approach it in that way, and I try to carry myself with a lot of integrity, even if that means having to step away from projects. So I've had projects pulled from under me because, you know, there was a change in administration, or the funding got pulled, or I could no longer do what we had agreed to do with the tribe, and it no longer felt okay to continue with a project. And so, and you have to communicate that to funders and say, I can't do this. We're not going to be able to do this anymore the way that it should be done, and I don't want to continue, you know, because it's like your integrity is on the line, not just as a scholar, but as a relative. And so I feel like ultimately I've you know, I've gotten pushback in lots of different spaces, but I've been very humbled to be able to carry out some really good work. I really also believe I'm at the beginning of my career, and so I have a lot to learn. But I try to let communities lead, and I see myself as a worker bee. You know, I'm a worker bee. I have a set of skills. I want to eventually become obsolete. Like, I really feel I want to train this army of data warriors who can go out and do this work, so that, you know, I don't see myself as occupying this space in this, you know, in this way long term, which I think kind of goes against kind of Western notions of the academy, right? So what I also will say is that it's also been very hard to convince non-Indigenous entities to support this work and to come on board, because there's no imperative, right? There's no legal imperative that makes anybody follow. Like, there's no law that says that federal agencies should uphold Indigenous data sovereignty. There's a tribal consultation, you know, process, but we all know that that's also quite limited, right? And so there's having to lean on kind of ethical imperatives, or more kind of moral imperatives, to compel entities to engage in this work and to respect Indigenous data sovereignty, and to is hard. You have to kind of, I think, like, be a little creative. But I mean, Randy knows this, you know, we've served on the Census Bureau's advisory council for many years. And I mean, sometimes you just think that nothing's going to change, right? That these bureaucracies are so set in their ways that it becomes very difficult to try to affect change. But I will say that I think by continuing to produce high quality research and continuing to develop data by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples that can kind of pass, right, a certain bar that scholars and science, Western science, and that these gatekeepers try to impose. I think if we can continue to meet those standards and exceed those standards, right, that ultimately, unfortunately, that's a threshold that that's not the like be all end all standard of what I seek to do in my work, but it is definitely one of them, because I know that if I can show other statisticians and other economists and other demographers, hey, my data that I collected in partnership with a tribal nation or a community, look at all of the statistics I was able to do, right? All of the analyses, that is just as good as yours, right? And it is statistically significant, and I can show that it is valid. And so I think that there's an aspect to that we have to engage as Indigenous scholars. And that's kind of where I see being able to have an impact in non-Indigenous circles, especially in the federal government, is to continue to do high quality research, and to continue to use their tools, right, in ways that perhaps they didn't even think could be done.
Thank you. Those, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have a question from Cynthia, who is actually asking a little bit of a related question to this as well. So please go ahead, Cynthia. Unmute yourself. Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Small-Rodriguez. My question is just how can we apply like tribal demography to support language reclamation work? I'm working with my community that's Zapotec speakers, and I feel like most of the data comes from the federal Mexican government. And I've read a lot about like being critical of like sort of a deficit sort of approach to these kind of data sets.
Yeah, so often people say, thank you for your question. You know, often people talk about how there's just there's not enough data, right? Or there's this paucity of data, or there's, the data just aren't there. But actually, for Indigenous peoples, we're one of the most heavily surveilled and administered populations like in the world. I mean, we are, because we continue to be a threat to these settler colonial nations, they're keeping a tabs on us. I mean, we have so much data that's being collected on us all the time. And those data are largely in the coffers, right, of these federal agencies. Regardless of whether it's the US or whether it's Mexico or Canada or Australia or New Zealand or any of these countries. And so to me, it's thinking about how do we access those data, and how do we, it's almost like you kind of have to be, it's like we're trying to access these data, right, to and reclaim them and repurpose them in ways that make sense to us as Indigenous peoples, but also in ways that advance Indigenous sovereignty, right? And so it's almost like having to be like little data spies almost, right? And how do we access what's already there? How do we use it in ways that the feds could never ever fathom, right? Because they don't think that way. And so thinking about the way that I see Indigenous data being able to support language revitalization efforts, one of my mentors at the University of Arizona is Professor Daniel Martinez. But he's done a lot of survey research along the southern border, and he says, Desi, so many of the folks coming across the southern border, they don't speak Spanish, they speak Indigenous languages, right? And so we know that these folks trying to come into what is currently the United States are Indigenous peoples, so many of them, and they don't speak Spanish, they speak their Indigenous languages. And according to the federal definition of who is an American Indian or an Alaska Native, they qualify under that definition, right? So we have to start thinking much more broadly about indigeneity and about how Indigenous data is not just about, the 574 federally recognized tribes in what is the United States, right? But much, I mean, for me, it's like, I'm so thankful once again to my relatives in Aotearoa, because by studying and living there for almost 10 years, my thinking about indigeneity is so global. And these, boundaries, these colonial borders are like, I don't accept them, right, in my work and in what I do. And so thinking about how, with language revitalization, to get back to your point, I really see how grassroots data organizing, like we need to start thinking about data and building data and data organizing, like how we think about social movement organizing. Like building data is a social movement. It's a collaborative process, right? And as part of that movement, there's resistance that you're going to come across, but I see it because it's such a powerful tool, right? There's also, I think, often the pushback can be very significant too, because of the power that comes from data and the money and the resources that often follow data. So I guess all of this is to say that I want to encourage your work, and if I can support it, let me know. I'm also kicking off a project here in LA to try to partner with organizations who are serving largely the Oaxacan community here, to really start to think about how indigeneity, right? If we're thinking about boundaries of indigeneity, how we have to break out of this American Indian, Alaska Native, this constraint that we, this kind of very exclusive notion of who belongs. And in LA, there's such a significant population of Indigenous peoples here who are from Mexico and Central and South America. And we see that with the 2020 census. I mean, the 2020 census, we saw almost like a 90% increase from 2010 in who is an American Indian or Alaska Native. We're almost at 10 million, right? And so many of those people are Central and South American and Indigenous and from Mexico. So there's this reclamation, I think, of indigeneity that I think this data building movement can support, and I think vice versa, that this reclamation of indigeneity can also support the movement itself. So I see it very much as reciprocal. So thank you for your question. I don't know if I answered it, but thanks for the discussion.
Thank you.
Are there others who have questions that want to pose a question? If nothing comes to mind immediately, I'll jump in again. Oh, there is one. Okay, great. Who is that? Patrice Fisher. Please
Hi.
go ahead.
You said earlier that New Zealand was changing how they determined who belonged, quote unquote. What did they change to?
Yeah, so New Zealand also had blood quantum. So they utilized blood quantum as a federal policy to determine belonging to Maori tribes. So there's over 300 Maori tribes, and there was this federal definition that included blood quantum, and they departed from that in the 80s. And so now it's whakapapa, which is lineal descent. So now it's essentially, there's no blood minimum. If you have a descendant who is a part of a tribe, you are indigenous. So it's just pure lineal descent. And there are very meticulous records, however, of kinship and lineal descendancy that are maintained by tribes that are incredibly complex. And so so by saying it's just lineal descent, I'm not discounting the extensive research and data that tribes have that they've maintained, which is almost a miracle, right? In the face of every effort by colonizers to destroy that, they've maintained it. And so have we in the US. We have very, very complex, kinship systems that we have also maintained, right? But yet we continue to enforce a colonizer's tool and a metric of exclusion. So I think we're really, I think we're at a, sorry, there's something going on outside on campus. We're at a time in this country, I think an Indian country in the US, where tribes are trying to figure out how to do things differently. And so our relatives in New Zealand can really show us a new way, which is not a new way, it's an old way, right? Of acknowledging who our relatives are. And so they use lineal descent, which is what we are seeing quite a few tribes moving towards that here in the US as well.
Thank you.
And Professor Small-Rodriguez, we have a question from Mia Hubbard that's also related to this question.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to just hear a little bit of your opinion about those kind of the commercial ancestry tools that are out there in the world now and that folks are using, and how that impacts the federal census data, particularly now with the mixed race category. So like, someone will get back their Ancestry.com that says, oh, you're 1%, Native American, and somehow feel like they're entitled to be able to mark that on the census data, even though their lived experience may not really reflect that. I'm just curious what your thinking is about that, and whether that has if that's contributing in any way to the increase in the numbers for Native American, the population going up. So the increase in the 2020 census, how those two, I guess, are related, if at all.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I always defer to my colleagues who study this, directly. So Kim Tallbear, for example, is,
She's amazing.
This is her whole work. But there are lots of others. She's trained so many other students who are doing this type of work, right, with respect to Native American DNA and Ancestry.com and all of these tests. And but so my stance on it, right, is as a demographer and as a social scientist, I come at it from thinking about the census. The census is what it is, right? The census always has been and always will be a tool of self-identification. It is one of the most open forums for identifying who we are. But of course, it's still very constrained, right? Because we still know that, yes, we can self-identify as however we want, but we can only self-identify so long as there are checkboxes to identify with, right? So we still know that there's lots of limitations, especially with respect to kind of gender diversity, but also with respect to lots of other, racial and ethnic identities that continue to not be included. So with that, my stance is always that I believe the census should absolutely remain an open instrument for self-identification. I think it tells us something very unique, right? That it tells us we can see change over time and how people are identifying, and people who previously identified perhaps as white, or previously identified perhaps as Black, or previously as other, right? Or maybe they didn't identify at all, are now identifying as a specific, as a member of a certain racial or ethnic group. So if we think about American Indian or Alaska Native, you know, it's interesting to think that perhaps with the very strict requirements that a lot of tribes have for belonging, right? Maybe we're seeing that perhaps the census numbers are maybe those are closer to the true numbers of who is an American Indian or Alaska Native, if we were to think about lineal descent as being the overall criteria for belonging. But that also, you know, that stands, that's my perspective as a social scientist, right? As a citizen of a tribal nation, and as somebody who firmly believes in sovereignty, right, and the political authority of tribes, that those census numbers are pretty meaningless to tribes at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
Because 9.7 million American Indians or Alaska Natives, that refers to a population that tribes don't really care about, right? Because who do they care about? Their people, their citizens. And so I go back to thinking about how, you know, this is not an either or, this is an and, right? We need the census, and we need tribal censuses as well, right? And we need to ensure that there is data capacity and capability at the tribal level, and, you know, that tribes are collecting data and maintaining data on their citizens, and that is being done no matter where their citizens live, because we know that the vast majority of Native peoples no longer live on reservations or on their tribal homelands. So to me, I see this like, I often get, you know, asked, you know, whether I believe that, you know, similar questions to this, a similar question to this, and I really believe it's an and question. We need both. And I use different data for different reasons, right? And that's how can I see there. I see tremendous utility in the census data because it is this open instrument of self-identification. It can we see, you know, it's exciting to me also if we think about that numbers is power, right? If we can think about inclusivity as leading and as, you know, an increase in population resulting in power, right? Because our demographic block is growing. That's not to say that, you know, there are lots of folks, right, who probably, like you just said, right, took a test and found out that they've got some sort of American Indian blood from some sort of genetic test that, you know, of course, will never tell you anything about tribal belonging. But, you know, the fact that those individuals are now identifying as American Indian, I don't have a problem with that. For me, it's like, okay, that is more data that's coming in about a certain segment of the population, right? And who am I to say that they're not American Indian or Alaska Native? I'm just about trying to get as much data as we can to tell stories and to tell as complex, you know, to tell complex stories. So ultimately, we're a heterogeneous, diverse population, and I think we need to have all the data that we can. That's also not, I don't want everyone to discount tribal sovereignty and the authority and the control and the sole authority and control of tribes to determine who belongs. But I am also, as a scholar of you know, tribal demography and as a demographer, I'm seeing that there is this increase in tribes moving away from very strict blood quantum. So that's also telling us something, right? That there is a response to the fact that American Indians and Alaska Natives are the most racially mixed population in the US. And we know that we're mixed mostly with white, right? So it's complicated. And I guess for me, I just believe that the more data we have, the better, and that we need to tell complex stories because we're allowed to be complex people.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question? I think, Mia, you asked Cheryl Quintana. Do you want to ask your question?
Okay, sorry, I was unmuting. Yeah, I'm in a place I can't really show my picture, but thank you very much for doing this. And I just found that I host Latinas in Hollywood, Our Stories and Her Stories, and we bring a lot of different women of diversity into the paneling. And then I noticed that I was calling out to a lot of Indigenous women because I know that we all also have this broad base of Indigenous people, right, from different areas. But I just saw there was a lot of resentment in a lot of ways, that people not thinking, well, oh, now you're saying you're Indigenous because you got this DNA test. And it was not 1%, mine's 20, like 20 to 25%. But the bottom line is I'm just trying to engage our women into sharing their stories from various points of view, and also obviously within the Indigenous, is because I believe that, you know, this is the group that we all came from, and we need to go back into that kind of thinking in order to raise our levels of power within women and within our society and at large. So I don't know, I just, my question was just, have you gotten a lot of, well, maybe they don't resist you, but you know, in knowing that you have a lot of different background inside you, like you just said, but wasn't it the Asians who came down to these continents? You know, and like you just said, we blended with Europeans, and I have Middle Eastern and African and Asian. I have it all, right? So I just don't understand why people want to also limit and also, you know, get mad at others who want to come into knowing who they are and where they came from and where we can help and do the best together.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, right? But ultimately, I mean, I stand very firmly by the fact that none of us are identity police, right? And that if we all have very different lived experiences as Indigenous peoples, especially, you know, for Indigenous peoples who are not connected, right, to their communities, to their lands, Indigenous peoples who don't know, you know, to whom they belong, right? That's probably one of the biggest things, is that we have generations now of Indigenous peoples who don't know who they belong to, which nations they belong to, but they know that they're Indigenous somewhere, somehow. And, you know, this is all to say that, you know, for me, it's like, and I can only speak to my experience and to what I do as a scholar and as a researcher, but I believe that the diversity and the heterogeneity of the Indigenous lived experience needs to be inclusive, and
Right.
we need all of the data to be able to advance that narrative. And that, yes, some of the people who are the most exclusive, right, and in this work or in this area are tribal leaders, right, and citizens of tribal nations right here in the US who are wanting to keep those gates closed, right? And why? Because there's a scarcity mentality, right, that has been introduced into our communities, not by ourselves, right? This is a colonial project, and we see it alive and well and at work generation after generation. And so for me as a scholar, I see my role as somebody who, if I can do good data work, if I can try to amplify the heterogeneity and the diversity of the Indigenous lived experience, and present that data and that information, you know, that's one thing, right? But also just creating space to acknowledge that, you know, the work of reconnecting, I think, is happening. It's hard, you know, people are reconnecting with their Indigenous roots however they need to, and I encourage that, right? And that can be done while also upholding and affirming tribal sovereignty. I don't see these as, you know, as competing aims at all. For some reason, and we know what that reason is, right? Colonialism and scarcity and assimilation, they have been very much pitched against each other. So I just want to affirm that, yes, what you're saying is very valid and true. And you know, there is a lot of room for lots of different opinions and perspectives, and I just offer one. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I put in the chat, if you ever want to speak to our group of high school, college, and recent grads about your Indigenous story and your ancestry on the matrilineal end, we'd love to have you come and share.
Thank you. So
Yeah, I'm going to put that in.
I'll just sort of conclude on that as well. I think, this idea of identities and communities and individuals identifying themselves and re-identifying themselves. Lots of places and lots of communities we're learning. It's a new process. These are new areas where how do we bring people back in who were pushed out for all kinds of reasons, historical, racist reasons, who were relocated and who were adopted out. There are lots of people for whom that's the case. And I think this is a process of learning, how do we incorporate, how do we bring people back in the fold? And that only comes about from, the success and the perseverance of communities, of Indigenous communities. The healthier Indigenous communities are, the more resilient they are, the more able they are to bring more people in and help support that. So I see that as, exactly the kind of work that Dr. Small-Rodriguez does. So with that, I want to thank you again for spending the hour with us and enlightening us and enriching our world, and give you a round of applause and say thank you. Have a good weekend to you and to all. Thank you.
There you go. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.